Stress isn't random. Overthinking isn't a personality flaw. They're signals that something in your system is misaligned. Most people try to silence stress. Very few try to understand its structure. Today, we'll do that. Here are 20 life equations that explain stress and overthinking, not to make them disappear, but to make them predictable. Equation 1. Stress equals overthinking divided by self-care. Once you see stress as a ratio, you stop treating it like a mystery. When overthinking increases while self-care drops, stress rises automatically. Not because you're weak, and not because the problem is too big, but because the system is unbalanced. This explains why trying to think your way out of stress often makes it worse. You're increasing thought inside a mind that no longer has the capacity to process it. At this point, effort becomes misdirected. Pushing for clarity doesn't help, because clarity depends on the condition of the mind doing the thinking. When that condition improves, the same problem suddenly feels smaller, even if nothing externally changed. Seeing this equation doesn't remove stress, but it ends the argument with it, and that alone begins to quiet the system. Equation 2. Anxiety equals uncertainty times importance. Anxiety becomes easier to understand when you see where it comes from. It doesn't appear around everything. It appears only where uncertainty overlaps with something that matters. This is why anxiety attaches itself to relationships, identity, health, and the future, places where the outcome feels personal and unresolved. Once you recognize this structure, anxiety stops feeling like an enemy. It's no longer a signal that something is wrong with you, but a signal that something meaningful lacks clarity. Trying to remove anxiety without addressing uncertainty only intensifies it. The system keeps firing because the equation hasn't changed. When uncertainty is reduced, even slightly, anxiety softens. Not because you stopped caring, but because care finally has direction. Equation 3. Overthinking equals control minus action. When action disappears, control doesn't vanish. It turns inward. The mind dislikes open loops. If nothing moves in the external world, it starts simulating movement internally, replaying conversations, predicting outcomes, rehearsing futures. It feels like preparation, but it quietly traps energy and thought. Once you see this equation, something shifts. You stop asking why your mind won't shut up. You realize it's trying to compensate for a lack of movement. Thought is doing the job action hasn't done yet. At that point, thinking less stops being the goal. Restoring motion becomes the natural correction. The mind doesn't calm because you silence it. It calms when it no longer has to carry momentum alone. Equation 4. Mental noise equals inputs minus processing. Mental noise isn't caused by complexity. It's caused by accumulation without completion. Information enters faster than it can be integrated. Conversations, ideas, worries, content, all pile up without being processed. What isn't digested remains unfinished, and unfinished things create background noise. When you see this equation, silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling necessary. Silence gives the mind time to finish what it already started. Over time, thoughts settle not because you forced them to, but because they finally had space to land. Clarity doesn't come from learning something new. It comes from letting what you already know stop competing for attention. Equation 5. Calm equals safety minus urgency. The nervous system doesn't respond to logic. It responds to urgency. When everything feels urgent, the body stays alert, a quiet emergency that never ends. Over time, this constant readiness becomes stress. Most of what we label as urgent isn't truly time-sensitive. It's emotionally loud. But the body doesn't distinguish between the two.
Seeing this equation changes how you relate to calm. Calm isn't created by solving everything. It appears when urgency drops and proportion returns. When fewer things demand now, the system softens on its own. Peace doesn't arrive when life is finished. It arrives when false alarms stop controlling the nervous system. Equation 6. Burnout equals output minus recovery. Burnout doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. Output stays high while recovery slowly disappears. At first, you don't notice. You still perform. You still function. But the margin shrinks. What once felt manageable now feels heavy. What once felt neutral now feels draining. Seeing burnout as subtraction changes the story. It's no longer about weakness or lack of discipline. It's about a system running in deficit. Recovery wasn't removed intentionally. It was postponed, again and again, until postponement became normal. At some point, the body stops negotiating. It collects what was delayed. Burnout doesn't mean you pushed too hard. It often means you stopped returning to baseline and called it resilience. Equation 7. Pressure equals expectations minus capacity. Pressure builds when expectations rise faster than capacity. Sometimes those expectations come from the outside. More often, they come from within. You expect more output, more consistency, more progress, without expanding time, skill, or support. The gap widens, and pressure fills it. What makes this dangerous is that pressure initially feels motivating. You interpret it as ambition. Only later does it harden into something constant, a background weight you carry everywhere. Seeing this equation removes the moral framing. Pressure isn't proof that you care more. It's proof that something is misaligned. At some point, the system doesn't need more effort. It needs recalibration. Equation 8. Mental fatigue equals decisions times time. Mental fatigue rarely comes from doing too much. It comes from deciding for too long without rest. Each choice costs a small amount of energy. Over time, those costs accumulate. By the end of the day, even simple decisions feel heavy. Not because they are, but because the system is depleted. When you see fatigue this way, it stops feeling mysterious. You realize why stress spikes at night, why clarity fades after long days, why the mind starts replaying instead of resolving. Fatigue doesn't always mean you chose poorly. It often means you chose continuously. Sometimes the mind isn't overwhelmed by problems. It's exhausted from carrying choice without pause. Equation 9. Stress loop equals thought times emotion. Stress sustains itself through feedback. A thought triggers emotion. Emotion sharpens the thought. Each reinforces the other. Over time, the loop becomes self-sufficient. You're no longer reacting to reality. You're reacting to your reaction. Seeing this equation changes how you relate to thinking. You stop assuming the solution lives in analysis. Thought is part of the loop, not the exit. The loop breaks through interruption, not understanding. Stress isn't always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's a circuit that needs to be broken. And clarity often returns not when you think better, but when the system finally resets. Equation 10. Relief equals expression divided by suppression. What isn't expressed doesn't disappear. It compresses. Thoughts held back, emotions swallowed, reactions postponed. Over time, suppression increases internal pressure. Not dramatically, just persistently. A tightness that never fully releases. Seeing relief as a ratio reframes strength. Silence isn't always control. Often, it's storage. Expression allows internal energy to move. When expression increases, pressure drops. When suppression continues, stress compounds. Relief doesn't arrive because everything is resolved. It arrives because something finally moved. And sometimes the body relaxes not because the load is lighter, but because it's no longer being carried alone. Equation 11. Clarity equals 1 divided by decisions. Clarity doesn't disappear because life is complicated. It disappears because too many decisions remain open. Every unresolved choice keeps a part of your attention occupied. Not actively, quietly. The mind holds possibilities in the background, waiting for resolution. Over time, this fragments focus. Nothing feels clear, not because you lack insight, but because too many threads are still running. Once you see clarity as the inverse of decisions, something shifts. You stop trying to understand more. You realize understanding isn't missing. Closure is. Even an imperfect decision can restore clarity because the system finally knows which direction energy is flowing. Clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It arrives when uncertainty collapses into direction. Sometimes the mind isn't confused. It's simply waiting for you to choose. Equation 12. Rumination equals past times inaction. The mind returns to the past when the present stands still. Rumination feels like reflection, but it isn't. Reflection moves forward. Rumination circles backward. The same moments replayed. The same questions asked without answers. Not because the past changed, but because nothing new is happening now. Seeing rumination as a product of inaction changes how you relate to it. You stop treating memory as the problem. The past tightens its grip only when the present lacks movement. When time stops feeling alive, the mind searches backward for control. Understanding the past doesn't loosen rumination. Movement does. Sometimes the mind isn't asking for insight. It's asking for proof that time is still moving forward. Equation 13. Emotional weight equals resistance times time. Pain doesn't become heavy immediately. It becomes heavy when resisted for too long. Resistance adds friction. Time compounds it. What could have passed through becomes something you carry. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was never allowed to move. When you see emotional weight this way, acceptance stops sounding passive. Acceptance isn't approval. It's the removal of internal opposition. When resistance drops, the same emotion feels lighter, not because it vanished, but because the struggle against it ended. Many people pride themselves on endurance, but endurance without release turns pain into burden. Some things don't heal because they were solved. They heal because they were finally allowed to exist. Equation 14. Overwhelm equals tasks minus structure. Overwhelm isn't caused by having too much to do. It's caused by having no clear sequence. When everything feels equally important, the mind freezes. There's no starting point, no edge to begin from. Stress emerges not from volume, but from disorder.
Seeing overwhelm as a lack of structure changes the response. You stop blaming yourself for feeling incapable. You realize the system is asking for order, not motivation. The moment the next step becomes obvious, pressure drops, even if the workload stays the same. Overwhelm feels emotional, but its solution is architectural. When life feels heavy, the mind may not need energy. It may need a map. Equation 15. Stability equals routine times recovery. Stability rarely looks impressive. Routine anchors the nervous system. Recovery restores it. Without routine, life feels chaotic. Without recovery, it feels draining. Together, they create predictability, and predictability calms the system. When stability is missing, the mind stays alert. Alertness turns into tension. Over time, tension becomes stress. This is why people who live in constant variability often feel exhausted without knowing why. Seeing stability as a system, not a personality trait, changes how you value it. Stability isn't stagnation. It's the ground that allows movement without collapse. Most people chase breakthroughs. Few protect foundations. But foundations are what make movement sustainable. Equation 16. Peace equals acceptance plus boundaries. Peace doesn't arrive when everything is resolved. It arrives when you stop arguing with what already exists. Acceptance removes the internal conflict with reality. Boundaries remove the external drain. Without acceptance, you waste energy resisting facts. Without boundaries, you absorb pressures that were never meant to be yours. Many people practice one without the other and wonder why peace never lasts. Seeing peace as a system changes how you relate to it. You stop chasing calm as a feeling and start noticing where energy leaks. Some battles end not because you won, but because you stopped showing up to them. Peace isn't passive, it's selective, and it begins the moment you decide what no longer gets access to you. Equation 17. Confidence equals preparation divided by fear. Confidence isn't built by eliminating fear. It's built by shrinking its influence. Fear grows in empty space, where preparation is missing. When you prepare, the unknown becomes familiar. Not safe, but recognizable. The mind relaxes when it knows the terrain, even if the outcome remains uncertain. Seeing confidence as a ratio changes how you interpret it. Confidence isn't bravado, it's readiness. It doesn't require certainty, only the knowledge that you can respond. Fear doesn't disappear, but it stops dominating the equation. Confidence doesn't announce itself. It's felt quietly, when fear speaks and preparation answers first. Equation 18. Mental freedom equals focus minus distraction. Mental freedom isn't the absence of responsibility. It's the absence of fragmentation. Distraction pulls attention in multiple directions at once. Each pull feels small, but together they leave the mind scattered and restless. Stress often isn't caused by what you're doing. It's caused by everything else trying to claim your attention simultaneously. When you see freedom as subtraction, not addition, something shifts. Freedom doesn't come from more options. It comes from fewer targets. Focus feels restrictive at first, but over time it creates space. Freedom isn't doing everything. It's no longer being pulled by everything. And when attention stays, the mind finally feels whole again. Equation 19. Resilience equals stress plus recovery. Resilience isn't built by avoiding stress. It's built by returning from it.
Stress alone damages the system. Recovery alone weakens it. The sequence matters. Stress followed by recovery strengthens. Stress without recovery erodes. Life inevitably applies pressure. What defines resilience is what happens next. Seeing resilience this way removes the heroic narrative. Resilience isn't about how much you can endure. It's about how consistently you return to baseline. Quietly, repeatedly. Resilience doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. And that ordinariness is what makes it reliable. Equation 20. Peace of mind equals control. Divi. Acceptance. The more you try to control what cannot be controlled, the more tension you create. Control without acceptance becomes force. Acceptance without control becomes helplessness. Peace of mind emerges when effort matches reality, when control is applied only where influence exists, and acceptance absorbs the rest. Seeing this equation changes where energy goes. You stop negotiating with outcomes that were never yours. Attention returns to response, choice, and presence, the few things that actually remain within reach. Peace of mind isn't letting go of everything. It's letting go of the impossible. And what remains, quietly, is usually enough. Stress doesn't disappear when life becomes easy. It disappears when life starts to make sense. These equations won't remove pressure from your life, but they can remove confusion about where that pressure comes from. And when pressure is understood, it stops feeling personal. It stops feeling endless. If one equation stayed with you, don't rush to apply it. Just notice it. The next time stress appears, the next time your mind starts looping. Awareness doesn't solve everything, but it changes where you stop fighting. This channel isn't about fixing yourself. It's about seeing the system clearly enough that unnecessary struggle falls away on its own. If this way of thinking resonates, you're welcome to stay. Not for motivation, not for answers, but for structure and the quiet clarity that follows.